Today you're going to hear from Representative Lance Russell, Al Carlson, Shad Olson, State Senator Bruce Rampelberg, who wants to talk about compromise. You'll hear Ron Burtz with the Revival Report, Ed Rendazzo, and I do a news review that you don't want to miss. Stay tuned. In the gubernatorial campaign, now Governor Dennis Daugaard said, illegal immigration in South Dakota isn't a problem. Well, Representative Lance Russell, I think time has proven that he was wrong. And we're hopeful that he'll now do something about it.
Well, I would tell you that as a state's attorney in Hot Springs, it always seemed that about once a year or once every 6 months, we would end up with some illegals that had warrants out of other states ending up in our jail and having access to attorneys and interpreters and a jury trial in front of Fall River County juries,
yes,
and costing us an enormous amount of money.
Well, and now we see in recent days that an industry, the logging industry, which gets some state grants and that kind of thing, is actually funding the employment of illegals in South Dakota.
I think it's much more pervasive than anyone wants to admit. In fact, in 2009, now U.S. Attorney Brendan Johnson actually issued a press release that said that illegal immigration cases were the #1 case that was filed in the state of South Dakota.
Well, and a recent study showed that the cost to South Dakota taxpayers, folks, you listening, you sitting there watching this today, the cost to you on an annual basis for illegal immigration in South Dakota is between $30 and $40 million.
I would have to agree, and that probably doesn't take into account the criminal aspect of this. And that's probably just welfare that we're dishing out and education benefits. It
and
probably
health
has nothing to do with all of the criminal activity. How can you ever calculate how much that actually costs society?
Well, and we know for a fact that illegal immigrants have been responsible for the death of South Dakota citizens.
Yeah, that is correct.
It is a serious problem. It was serious back then, but it's serious now. And what would you suggest needs to be done?
Well, in the last session, I was a co-sponsor of a bill that essentially plagiarized the Arizona law that was recently upheld by the United States Supreme Court.
And what happened to that bill, Lance?
It was killed in committee by the Republican members of the legislature. And it is my intent that if someone else doesn't bring it again, that I certainly will do so and be a co-sponsor of that bill, if not the prime sponsor. And
yes,
the reason is that we need to take affirmative action as it regards this issue, because it does affect South Dakotans and it costs the state and the local governments an enormous amount of money.
Well, if we're talking between $30 and $40 million that we spend on illegal immigrants, Lance, you and I know what we could do with education. We wouldn't be seeing a 25% proposed increase in sales tax if we were able to use that money.
Yeah, and nearly 30 students per teacher in some classrooms in Custer that no longer gets any state aid.
At a time when every dollar just is very difficult to come by, we're spending millions, tens of millions of dollars in South Dakota on illegal immigrants. And in the state legislative session last year, you just heard it, that a bill to end that was killed by the Republican leadership. Now, if the governor would get behind that legislation, it would very likely pass.
Well, in fact, the governor's office testified against it.
Did you hear that?
It is correct. They actually took an active role in killing that bill with the Republican leadership.
What's their motivation for that, Lance? I don't understand
I can't understand it. I don't know that I listened to that. I wasn't on the committee, so I didn't listen to the testimony that occurred. But I do know, in talking to the prime sponsor, because I was a co-sponsor, that in fact the governor's office testified against that legislation.
Well, folks, I would just encourage you to make another call to the governor's office and ask him to do what he did on the healthcare exchanges, change his direction. and support legislation that would end illegal immigration in South Dakota. Call the governor's office today and encourage him, once again, to do the right thing.